Ben Buchanan, White House Special Advisor on AI. Thanks for being here with us at the Cyber Initiatives Group.
Thanks so much for having me.
There's so many areas that we could launch into this conversation, so much going on right now. Let me start a little bit broadly and ask you, what do you see as the sort of leading challenges when it comes to national security that AI is best able to address right now?
I think there's a lot we can do with the technology, and one of the things we're working on right now is the National Security Memorandum, which is tasked by the executive order, and that's making sure that we harness the technology uh, as an intelligence community, as a Department of Defense, a broader national security community, in a way that advances American interests, but also in a way that lives up to American values. And I think there certainly is basically every part of our national security community can put this technology to work. We've got to do it in a way that's responsible, but we see a lot of opportunities really across the whole enterprise. And that document's meant to make sure we're seizing those opportunities.
That's a memorandum that you're currently working on. That this is
That's right. It's due at the end of July, so you can hold us to that deadline.
okay. Okay, great. The president issued an executive order on AI last October that was really focused on, in its own terms, seizing the opportunity or the promise, I believe, and managing the risk. But even the order acknowledged that a lot of work really needs to be done to be able to do this effectively, and to do these things at the same time. How's that going so far?
Good. So we tasked out a number of deliverables in that executive order. We have met 100% of them on schedule. We did a 90-day update not too long ago, where we had a tracker that showed everything that was tasked that was due in 90 days, and we've done all of those things. Probably the most significant one where we're doing a lot of institution building is setting up the AI Safety Institute at the Department of Commerce at NIST. And we've brought over a great inaugural director of that, woman named Elizabeth Kelly, who worked on the executive order when she was at the White House. And she is building a very strong team there, in addition to the folks who've been at NIST for a long time, to develop standards and capability evaluations and guidance to make sure AI systems are safe, so that we can seize the opportunities in exactly the way that you just mentioned.
Yeah, it's a big task. A big part of the way forward as well for the US government when it comes to the development and the security of AI involves working with the private sector. I'm wondering, what have you learned in terms of conversations that you've had with leaders from the private sector, specifically since this executive order was released?
The work with the private sector has gone back even before the executive order. So we had the companies come to the White House and make voluntary commitments to the president about what they were going to do even before the executive order to make sure their systems were safe, secure, and trustworthy. But I think both before and after the executive order, one of the things I really value the most from the private sector is a very detailed technical understanding of how fast this technology is moving and what it is capable of. And I think this gets to a broader point that's really important, which is this is really the first technological revolution, certainly in probably at least 100 years, maybe you can go back further, where the US government is not the one inventing the technology. And if you look at the early days of the internet or the space race or microprocessors or radar or certainly nuclear weapons, you had a very strong government hand in shaping the direction of the technology. Now, you did have that in AI in the 1960s. So, given the current paradigm we're in today, where it's very private sector driven, I think we really value the conversations with the executives and also with technical experts at the companies to understand what the technology is capable of and how we can manage it.
So how are you
And
given
I
that?
should say we're also talking to a wide range of folks beyond just the private sector. It's also civil society and academia and the like. But your question is about the private sector, and that's what we get from them, I think.
It's an incredible challenge. I mean, as you laid out, it's the first time that the US government really has to get very heavily involved in something that is rapidly being developed outside of the US in a way. Is it changing the way you're sort of thinking about approaching what the government can and should do here?
I think it's changing the way we recruit people to the government, because that is fundamental to making sure we can meet the moment. And with the executive order, we launched AI.gov, which really was one-stop shopping for all the AI jobs in the government. You've been around government to know it is a surprisingly Herculean effort to collate all of the different AI jobs from all the different agencies and put them in one place, which we did. And we also expanded our fellowship programs and our rapid hiring programs to bring in a lot of talent. A good example of an agency that's doing this is Department of Homeland Security, which has created an AI core where they've hired 50 people or so to come in and be AI experts with technical backgrounds and the like. And we have been flooded with interest on AI.gov and on the various fellowship programs like the U.S. Digital Service and the like of folks with technical skills who want to come work for the government. So I think that's really been the biggest change for us is making sure, in addition to the great people we have, we're getting tech savvy folks who maybe have never worked in government before, never thought about working in government before, but are responding to this moment.
It was interesting. I was just on the West Coast about a week ago at a big investor summit. And one of the people who was on stage talking about one of the things that is really limiting the US right now in terms of its competitive and technology is immigration policy. I don't want to get too far out of your lane in this interview, but I'm just kind of curious, are these conversations happening? Because you have China, which has a massive population that it can draw from simply because it's not a democracy. You have other countries that have incredible talent, but are you talking and thinking about the future and the immigration policy when it comes to how it's going to impact the US's ability to stay competitive on AI?
For sure. So we have a lot of homegrown talent. It's important we have an education system that develops that homegrown talent. America has, a huge percentage of the world's great universities that develops a lot of our own talent, but it also attracts a lot of talent. And I think the executive order tries to make sure we're bringing that AI talent to the United States as well. And there's a section of the executive order that tries to streamline through state and through DHS our processes for bringing in talent from abroad. As you know, there's pretty significant limits to what you can do through executive action alone in this area. Mercifully, Congress and immigration are not in my lane, so I don't do as much with that. But I think it's fair to say that we recognize this as a huge advantage the United States has. It has been historically. It will continue to be in the age of AI, and we're trying to lean into getting as much talent to the United States as possible.
It was interesting for me to hear that bubble up at a meeting among investors. We're really still in the early days of AI advancement. You have GPT 2, 3, 4, 5 being worked on. There's huge promise and risk, as you already know, as the US is really in an AI race with China. I'm wondering, what is the White House doing with regulators and others in particular to help us move faster when it comes to AI defense and innovation?
I think there's an overarching point here, which is the talent point, right? So we want to have AI talent in the government to regulate the technology, and that's not just at the White House; it's also throughout the broader interagency. So that's the first thing. But then, in terms of the broader question of how do we actually regulate this technology, we've taken a two-pronged approach. The first is for applications of the technology in particular regulated sectors, such as healthcare, financial services, housing, those sectors that have been regulated with good reason for a very long time. We have continued to vest the authority to regulate AI in those sectors with those regulators. And the logic here is pretty straightforward, which is if something is illegal without AI, it is illegal with AI. And that's true for discrimination and bias in the healthcare system and things like that. And certainly it's true for things like AI safety in the healthcare context and elsewhere. So that's the first part. Then the second part is how do we manage the safety and security of what's often called frontier systems? So these really powerful general purpose systems. And this is where we set up the AI Safety Institute at the Department of Commerce. Now, the AI Safety Institute is not itself a regulator. It's at NIST, which is not a regulator, but it sets standards and guidance, or is in the process of setting standards and guidance that companies have voluntarily said they will sign up to in terms of their voluntary commitments. And then we also use the Defense Production Act, also through the Department of Commerce, to make sure the companies are performing the safety tests that they said they would perform, and they're sharing those results with us. So it's not a neat one-stop shopping for regulation, but in our view, nor should it be.
Okay, very interesting.
Given how broad AI is, of course.
Yeah. All the sort of chips and GPUs, we've seen headlines about that every day, it seems like. They're all produced by just a handful of companies. And it takes sometimes years, some are speculating decades, to really be able to create the infrastructure to be able to produce those chips inside the United States. I'm wondering, how can the US build more chip foundries and more plants in the US? What are sort of the biggest challenges there?
the biggest challenge, of course, is it's very hard to do, as your question suggests. And this, I think, is one of the most complex, if not the most complex thing we do as a species. And it's incredibly intricate, truly amazing work. Now, the president and led the way in getting the Chips and Science Act passed in the summer of 2022, and the Department of Commerce and other agencies have been implementing that. And I think we actually saw some big grants go out to companies like Intel and others just earlier this week to make good on this promise of bringing in the chip manufacturing and the chip supply chain back to the United States. So it certainly will be, it will take years to do, but we've made some big investments that are very strategic in making sure we have production here in the United States because it is so vital.
I was going to say, how would you rate this on the priority scale for you on a day-to-day basis?
We have a whole program office at the Department of Commerce, the CHIPS program office that manages this, and, administering. I think it's 40 or $50 billion. So this is their job, but I think it's fair to say we work closely with the Department of Commerce on AI, including on this, and we know that American competitiveness in AI depends on chip manufacturing and chip supply chains because AI is so inextricably intertwined with that technology.
Yeah. Let me stay deep in the weeds on sort of the private sector and the business issues for just a minute. It's such a complicated environment, but Hong Kong has just passed a bill, I think they call it Article 23, criminalizing expanded state secrets in their wording to include social and technological developments. Do you think this means that businesses need to start pulling back from China? I understand the implications of what a huge question that is, but when you see something like this and you worry about what's going to fall under that technological tent in terms of their interpretation, how are you thinking about it?
I am definitely not a China expert nor a Hong Kong expert, so will give a broader answer here. But I think it is fair to say we have tried to look carefully at our China strategy and not to decouple from them, but to de-risk from them, and to try to make sure that in areas of critical importance we are safeguarding the flow of data and the like. So the president signed a couple of weeks ago a data security executive order, which when it's fully implemented through the rulemaking process, will block the large-scale export of American sensitive personal data to China. But I think it's fair to say businesses should look carefully at what's happening there, and should recognize that their data is often incredibly valuable, and they should make sure they're protecting it.
Yeah, it is such a massive question, and it's difficult, I think, for any one entity in general to answer, but critical that people have a broader understanding of how all of this is connected. Let me ask, Axios this week spotlighted a growing front for nation state and industrial cyber espionage, which was kind of interesting, breaking into AI developer systems to steal company secrets. Experts now are predicting that this new front is going to grow in the next 5 years to equal the threats that are faced by semiconductor companies. What can be done around this to strengthen AI system defenses, especially in startup firms that may lack sort of some, very solid security systems?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt we've seen recent cases, as you just suggested, where leading AI firms are a target of espionage from abroad. It makes perfect sense that this is an incredibly valuable, important technology. There's key algorithmic secrets each of these firms has. So I think every firm in this business should recognize that top tier cybersecurity is a key part of being in that business. And that's true in AI in the same way that's true in the defense industrial base, in the same way it's true in the financial sector and the like. So I think, certainly can encourage and work with firms and have done some of that at a reasonably high level. But at the end of the day, in the United States, the private sector has a lot of the burden of defending itself in how we've set up our cybersecurity system. I'm not sure these AI firms or any firm want U.S. government people defending their systems from the inside with all the complexity that would entail. But
Yeah.
there's no doubt the threat is real here.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. One of our cyber initiatives group principals, John Carlin, was commenting in a particular article, that one I mentioned on Axios, that he's found in some of the instances where he's talked to or counseled people, particularly at smaller companies, that sometimes they just haven't even thought about this at all. So I'm sure that's an issue that is going to be on everyone's radar for a while. Let's talk for just a minute about AI threats specific to China. How are you looking at competitiveness on a national security scale with China when it comes to AI, given that China is not a democracy, as I mentioned before, and has a massive population to draw from? Let's dig in a little bit more on that.
There's a couple different pieces of it. I think let's start with probably the most significant action we've taken related to AI in China, which is the chip controls that we put in place in October of 2022 and then updated in October of 2023. And those controls were motivated by a desire to stop China from using this technology to modernize its military, which it is certainly trying to do, and stop China from using this technology to oppress its people. And as you say, China is not a democracy. And there certainly is, I think, a lot of potential for technology like AI to be used to entrench autocracy, to entrench repression, to violate human rights. And we're very worried about that. And very worried about that abroad. And we're also making sure that as we use this technology, we don't use it in ways that are inappropriate and the like. So I think that's probably the area of focus for us with China right now is the military modernization and the domestic repression.
Mm-hmm. Um, Rob Joyce is just leaving an incredible career of service, National Security Agency, and he's held, of course, jobs with the White House as well. He was saying that he's pretty comfortable in terms of the nation's ability to ward off AI-driven disinformation in the run-up to this November's presidential election. How are you feeling about that in terms of your confidence that the government's going to be ready to sort of ward off any efforts on that front?
A good rule of thumb in the U.S. government is never disagree with Rob Joyce because he's almost always right. So I think Rob certainly had a tremendous career. That's absolutely right, and it's sad to see him go. We have to continue to be vigilant on the disinformation front, and I think there's what you might call like capital D disinformation and state actors and the like that AI might enable. But there's also things like fraud and like which I think a lot of it's the same technology, but could affect Americans every single day. And we tried to take steps through banning voice cloning and so forth to make sure we are guarding against that. And part of the voluntary commitments that the companies made to the president that they're still developing and have shown good progress in is a commitment to watermarking AI outputs and the like. So we are continuing to try to encourage that and facilitate that at a technical level and as a industry level, because I think it's so important to guarding against the threat of disinformation in a big picture foreign government sense, but also in the sense of everyday fraud.
It makes it some of those steps that are being developed are making it a little bit easier to identify faster sort of deep fakes when things are not real. But we just hosted a virtual event at which experts were really worried about scenarios in which AI created false narratives that surface, in that very quick time crunch, 24 to 48 hours before people go to the polls. And there might not be sort of the response time to say that something is false. Are you thinking about sort of rapid response measures using AI to counter some of these issues? If they
I
come
don't
to
know how we use AI, but I think I certainly agree with the concern here. And if you look at past activities, I think it was before a French election a number of years ago when there was an effort to try to right before the polls put out disinformation. So I think we have to be ready for the whole range there. And the good news is this is something that we are well aware of, and Caitlin Dirkovich and her team at the White House lead this effort. So I would defer to them on the particulars of what it is they are doing for this problem, but suffice it to say they are very aware of it and are preparing.
I'm wondering how you see, and this might be more of a personal question than a professional question, but how do you see the public's role in this? Do they have any chance at all of understanding without using other technology to tell you what's fake and what's not? What do you see as the public's responsibility?
On disinformation
Yeah.
in particular, or AI. Yeah, I think certainly there is an element of public resilience and critical thinking and all of that that's going to be very important. And
Yeah.
I suspect that we are rapidly entering a world in which the notion of a deep fake is becoming very widely understood. People will see them themselves, not just in a malicious context, but in a movie context or in a YouTube context or and the like. So folks I think are developing an understanding of what AI generated video can do and audio can do. And I think that's important for building this resilience and understanding of the world we're living in.
Yeah. Representatives of over 40 countries, signatories to the political declaration on responsible military use of artificial intelligence and autonomy, a little bit of a mouthful, are participating in a two-day meeting this week at the University of Maryland. I'm wondering what outcomes does the U.S. have in mind for this inaugural meeting on ethical uses of AI by military organizations? You touched on this a little bit, saying that this is a priority.
Yeah, that's right. And the Department of Defense, to their great credit, I think has thought a lot about autonomy in warfare, autonomy in weapon systems, long before we had ChatGPT. For that matter, long before we even had the algorithms and called the transformer that enable ChatGPT. So the Department of Defense has something called 3000.09, which is the guidance, the binding guidance in this area of how autonomy fits into warfare to ensure that we're using this technology in a way that's appropriate.
Yeah.
And the political declaration on military use of AI, as you gave the long version of it, long version of the title. That is meant to begin this conversation with the broader international community to try to set some norms of behavior here in a way that makes sure the technology is being used appropriately in combat and in preparation for combat. So I think this is a kickoff opportunity to set those norms.
Yeah, I thought I might wrap up our conversation today with a little bit of a scenario from something that came up on the Cipher Brief's radar during recent testimony before Congress. There was an expert from CSIS who posed a really interesting question, which is what would the impact on national security decision-making be if AI had been available during the Cuban Missile Crisis? And it was Benjamin Jensen who drew out a couple of possible effects of what that might have been like, saying with AI applications ranging from imagery recognition to logistics management and a generative rather analysis of adversary intentions at hand, he was suggesting there would be a tendency to speed up the crisis when it might make more sense to slow down decision making and be a little bit more deliberate. I'm just curious if you have thoughts on things like that and what goes through the mind of the White House special advisor on AI. Do you think about these things?
I have not thought about the Cuban Missile Crisis example. It's an interesting one,
Yeah.
but I think it's fair to say that part of the intelligence work that was fundamental to the Cuban Missile Crisis probably could be transformed by AI. So the ODNI, the Office of Director of National Intelligence, has an effort to use AI for intelligence analysis as part of a broader human-led cycle of intelligence analysis. And I think that's what Ben's getting at in that example. Imagery analysis is one of the areas that is particularly ripe for this, which of course was critical to the Missile Crisis because computer vision is a key part of AI. And the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency is an agency that's using a lot of AI. Has been very public about how they're trying to use more AI. So I think certainly in the intelligence side of it. But I think if you go back to the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's been a while since I've done this, a lot of the challenges of the Cuban Missile Crisis were about communication between the two sides, and there wasn't sufficient crisis communications, and there wasn't sufficient mechanisms to pass messages. I think they were sort of at one point they were passing messages through the TV correspondents who were covering the crisis and the like. So I think there probably is a lesson we can draw from the Cuban Missile Crisis, which applies even more urgently today, and that is the importance of crisis communications and being able to talk respectfully and responsibly to foreign governments to alleviate crises. And we've tried to work very hard to build this technology out. And in fact, President Biden and President Xi talked about managing AI risks and the need to do it together when they met in San Francisco in November. So there certainly are, I think, there's a recognition on our side at the most senior levels of the government of the importance of managing this technology and how it could change very fraught and very important international dynamics.
Yeah, and I don't want to put words in Ben's mouth, but you remember the television series, a very popular television series, 24, where everything is on a clock. And I think the idea being if you have the intelligence faster, do you still have the time that is needed for better communication in order to deconflict? So it's actually a fascinating scenario that was brought up. Let me just ask in closing, sort of what's really top of mind for you? Do you have sort of like 3-month, 6-month, 9-month targets where you say, this has to be done? I mean, you said right off the top that a lot of the things that were brought up in the executive order that was released in October, you've kind of checked the box, you're making timelines on that. But are there things that you see as more critical than others when it comes to the national security components of artificial intelligence?
I think that two of the big things coming up, both tasked by the executive order, are the what's called the Office of Management and Budget M memo or management memo, which is due in the 150-day mark. So that's due next week. And that governs how the federal government, aside from the national security community, will use AI. And this is an opportunity for us to operationalize a lot of the ideas we put together for the blueprint AI Bill of Rights that we published even before ChatGPT in October of 2022. So that's one. And then the other one is, as mentioned at the top of our conversation, the National Security Memorandum on AI, which I think is really important for how we're going to use it on the national security side, and also how we're going to counter adversaries and competitors from using it. So I think those are probably two deliverables, one due in a week, one due in 3 or 4 months or so, that are very much on our radar screen, and we're working very hard on them with the broader interagency.
Yeah. Ben Buchanan is White House Special Advisor on AI. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to chat with us and really share your thoughts on a lot of these issues. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.